Welcome, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Afua Asantiwa, the community convener at Food Secure Canada. I am the moderator for this webinar, which is being hosted to discuss Proof's 2021 report entitled Household Food Insecurity in Canada, and to coincide with National Truth and Reconciliation Month. We would like to begin by acknowledging Food Secure Canada is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganhaki Haga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jojage, the area Europeans came to call Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Let me do some housekeeping. First, to access interpretation, click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a web browser. If you join by phone, click on the ellipse icon. It's the 3 dotted lines, again at the bottom of your screen, and select the language you would like to listen in. To hear the interpreted language, just click Mute Original Audio. For technical assistance, please use the chat to write directly to Juliette Clochard, our tech person who is helping make this virtual gathering happen. For any questions you may want to ask panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Also, keep in mind this webinar will be recorded and posted. I now introduce you to Byron Beardy, who will do reflections to lead us into the webinar. Byron is the program manager for Manitoba's First Nations Food Security Department, which is housed at Four Arrows Regional Health Authority. Byron sits on various food security committees locally, regionally, provincially, and nationally, where he incorporates his native language and traditional knowledge into his food sovereignty work. I pass you on to Byron.
Hello, good morning. Busy one in the go. I mean to them. They were beginning in a nakum. Guys, they go much with the pinaguk to which you know. I go. Nungumega Kizikak, Kam Hunzatek, Wodokaki Machawat, Kagindo Shkunuat, Kagindo Kraman, Knamondo, Egomena, Mwe Nungupis Mamendemic, Wegazikizikak. I say good morning or good afternoon now. I'm in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, Central Standard Time. Thank you for that intro. As you said, my name is Byron. As Esfo said, my name is Byron Beardy. I am from Wasegamak First Nation in North Central Manitoba, and I work here at 4 Arrows RHA, my office behind here. I just wanted to say thank you for the invite, and in my language, what I spoke about was let's think today about what we hear nationally and all throughout Canada about Orange Shirt Day, about our children, my relations that unfortunately didn't come back, and we think about that as we speak today. As you notice, I'm wearing an orange shirt today. My children, my grandchildren went to school with their orange wear, so to speak. And it is with that mind that we don't forget these young children that left our communities, and most of them that we think about didn't come back. My personal story, my parents went to residential school. My uncle, my dad's brother, unfortunately never came back. And to this day, I and my father, which passed on already, do not know if he indeed is alive or dead. Since he finished school in southern Manitoba, after he kept going and never came back. So to this day, I don't know personally if my uncle Tyrus is alive or not. And so that's to think about that is some of our relations we don't know. And I remember my grandmother before she passed on saying too that it's not a good feeling when you don't know where your child is, whether if they're doing okay or not. And she died not knowing where her son was after school. So with that in mind, I want to say that we don't forget unfortunate atrocities that's happened to our people, and we're still here. So I don't want to be doom and gloom, but yeah, I think we are going to try and do what we can in relation to our the relationships that we have between the original inhabitants of this land we call Canada versus the visitors, what I call the visitors, which are the people that came and introduced the what we call today the normal, the urban, whatever we call them. And with that, I want to say that our with the Creator, we believe that we are here, still here for a reason, and that we're here to better ourselves, to not follow what has been forced upon us as in a people, not just Indigenous people, but all nations, to work together, to work in unison, and to unite as one, to work for a common goal. And this thing in particular, in relation to food, I always say that food is life, just like water is life. Without food, we can survive for 28 days. But in the end, we will die if we didn't have food. But it is us to put that knowledge together, to put that knowledge of what we know with food, and to use that knowledge to pass on to our younger generations to come. We're losing a lot of our cultural knowledge, if you will. I'm speaking as a whole. When I say cultural knowledge, it means where you're from, your nationality, your food practices is inherent to your nation, not just Indigenous. It could be Polish, it could be whatever. We have our national and cultural traditional foods, and a lot of us are losing that, where you come from. I talked a little bit about the 100-mile diets. It's one of the things that was taught early at an early age with me when I eat food from my land. Anything edible, I was fortunate enough to have been given by my grandmother. I ate from the land. And I was fortunate. And today when I talked about it with my children, you ate this, you eat, but they don't know that. They don't know the nutrients, the natural nutrients that we have from our food. And also introducing foreign foods to our bodies is not really made for my body. For example, I used something as simple as a banana. that's not natural to me, but it's natural to my relatives on the islands or in the southern. Those are natural foods for them, and their bodies are accustomed to that. And vice versa. These people are not naturally blueberries, for example. They probably don't have it there. So our bodies are accustomed to these things, and our bodies are naturally accustomed to them, that we can process them. But then when we were introduced the food, the foods that were introduced to us, the processed foods, that's what's killing us. That's what's killing our people. When we hear a lot of the chronic ailments of our indigenous nations, that to me was the 5 W's that was brought onto our people. The 5 W's, which includes sugar, salt, flour, milk, and fat, the lards. And that was packaged and gave to our people. And of course, it tastes good. If it tastes good, it's not good for you. If it tastes bad, that's the best food for you. But with that, those foods, and unfortunately, we consume a lot of that processed packaged foods, and that's not normal for us. When we go back to the lands, when we go back to our ways of eating, and that's the natural sugars and natural salts. And I don't need to teach you guys that. You guys know that. So that's what my goal, to me, is to bring back that knowledge to my grandchildren, to bring back the traditional, not to forget who we are, where we come from. So I don't have a timer, but I was told to keep it short. And short is a swear word to me, by the way, people. I'm only 5 foot something, but anyways, just a little blurb. I didn't want to be too serious. I didn't want to just to share a little thing, but I always honored to speak wherever I can, when I can, in relation to the work that I do, and also in relation to my people, my knowledge of the language and of some of the food that's been passed on to me by my elders, by my knowledge keepers, and fortunate enough to be able to speak my language and to read and write my language. And again, I thank you for that invitation and looking forward to the next hour. With that, I say miigwech. We have with us a lady by the name of Christina Craig. She's a board member of Food Secure Canada in the Yukon Territory. She's a coordinator of Yukon Anti-Poverty Coalition. Krista works to fulfill the organization mandate of facilitating the elimination of poverty in Yukon through education, advocacy, and of course, action. Ladies and gentlemen, I pass you on to Christina. Bonjour, Christina.
Bonjour. Thank you, Byron. And thank you really for that thoughtful reflection, and really, it's so important that we do take the time, because I think that is one of the pieces that makes it difficult sometimes for us to hear one another. So I appreciate and I'm grateful for your time. I'm also grateful to be here today on behalf of the board and staff of Food Secure Canada to welcome you to this webinar. I am joining you today from the traditional territories of the Kwanlin First Nation and the Ta'anquechun Council, otherwise known as Whitehorse. Whitehorse is a community of approximately 30,000 people, and the Kwanlin First Nation is the largest self-governing First Nation in the territory. On the eve of National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I'd also like to acknowledge the importance of the truth word in truth and reconciliation, and the importance of storytelling and of the real people of which we speak when we look at the data and recommendations coming out of Valerie's work and the work of proof. Here at the Anti-Poverty Coalition, we see the everyday impact of people not having enough money to afford the food that they want to eat, or the ability to get on the land to harvest. We see the impact of climate change on people's ability to get the food that is culturally important and necessary for them. We see that people living in rural and remote regions of the country are often forgotten. And we see how our charity-based food insecurity response continues to entrench racism, poverty, and inhibits people's ability to make decisions that are best for them and their families and their communities. Over the past 4 years, Food Security Canada has been working hard to recognize, highlight, and amplify the voices and solutions coming from people who are most impacted by food insecurity, Black, Indigenous, and Indigenous households from across the country who really need to be at the center and lead proposed policy solutions at the community level. Food Secure Canada in our new strategic plan is really highlighting our support for Indigenous food security, food sovereignty rather, and Black food sovereignty, where First Nations, Métis, and Inuit determine their own place-based food systems, advancing policies that will best support self-determined and resilient futures. And I can say that coming from a territory where 11 of the 14 First Nations here are self-governing, that's such an important piece of how to move forward. Finally, FSC's new strategic plan also highlights the importance of reaching Sustainable Development Goal number 2, zero hunger by 2030. We know that we can't reach that goal in Canada without solid government actions related to income. And the tools and policies that governments have are at hand, and they're everything, you know, when we're talking income, from basic income to income assistance to minimum wage, changes to employment. Anyway, all of those things, which I think we're going to hear from Valerie, who I am very pleased to introduce right now. So Valerie Tarasuk is, as probably everyone here knows, has done such important work on food insecurity in Canada, and I'm really pleased to welcome her. She is a professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Toronto and is the principal investigator of PROOF, our research program studying policy interventions to household food insecurity in Canada. And we're just so grateful that you're here with us today, Valerie, and over to you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Christina, and thank you very much for including us in this program today. I want to start by acknowledging where I am. The University of Toronto is situated on land that for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, still, it is home to many Indigenous people, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And I'm privileged to be able to live and work here. I will start sharing my screen now. And with that, I want to acknowledge a few other people before I start. Through this presentation, I'm drawing very, very heavily on work by 3 people in our group, Tim Lee, Andréane Fafard Saint-Germain, and Faye Men. So you'll hear me talk about them as we go forward. So to start, we are in this report on 2021, we're reporting for the first time on data from the Canadian Income Survey. And that's new for PROOF. It's a nationally representative sample of 56,000 people. Like the Canadian Community Health Survey and most other StatsCan surveys, it does not include people living on reserves or Indigenous settlements, and there are some other people excluded as well. We have moved to talking about food insecurity through the lens of the Canadian Income Survey because when food insecurity got measured, when it got added to that survey, very quickly it became clear that the survey was yielding different results than the Canadian Community Health Survey. And through a whole lot of work, we've come to conclude, and writing very much on the coattails of work by people at Statistics Canada, we think we're getting a more representative picture of food insecurity from the lens of the Canadian Income Survey. So that's why it's become our go-to for population prevalence. Just for those of you that are new to this world, the measurement of food insecurity on the Canadian Income Survey and the Canadian Community Health Survey is an 18-item module that ranges in severity from people worrying about not having enough food through to people going whole days without eating, all because of a lack of money for food. The module is coded by counting the number of times people say yes to questions about the experiences of food hardship. And you can see at the bottom of this slide the way that we're coding it so that we're moving forward kind of sequentially in terms of the severity of the experience to, at the end, severe food insecurity being people who affirmed enough of the 18 questions for us to believe that people in those households have actually gone without eating because of a lack of food and money for food. The results are stunning from the Canadian Community Health, or from the Canadian Income Survey. We used to talk in proof about 4.4 million Canadians living in food insecure situations, and that's not the right number. Through the 3 years where food insecurity has been measured, we're looking at around 6 million, or the most recent number being 5.84. There was a little bit of a dip between 2019 and 2020, but nobody should celebrate that. We're talking about a large problem, a problem that is pervasive and that for all intents and purposes hasn't moved. There have been a number of reports on food insecurity with prevalence estimates over the last few years. It seems like the interest in measuring this issue has really heated up through the pandemic. The primary window through the public domain into food insecurity continues to be food banks. So I think it's important for you to understand how the numbers we're reporting from the Canadian Income Survey compare to other numbers. The Food Banks Canada reports the number of people who visit food banks in a 1-month period. They're the blue bars here, and you can see that there is a very large order of magnitude difference between the number of people utilizing food charity in this country and the numbers that we're talking about in terms of food insecurity. Our national prevalence in 2021 works out to be about 1 in 6 households reporting some level of food insecurity. Here you see the differences across the provinces. In 2021, we're moving from a high of 20.3% in Alberta. So 1 in 5 households there reporting some level of food insecurity to a low of 13.1% in Quebec. So a very wide range depending on where you live. If we look at the 3 years for which food insecurity has been measured in the Canadian Income Survey, you can see some flux. But Quebec has always been much lower than the rest of Canada through these 3 years. And the movement is not very dramatic anywhere. There are some provocative drops like in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, and also this drop in BC that I think are very important to track going forward to see if there really is something happening in those provinces that is going to sustain a decrease. But overall, what we're seeing is a little bit of static, but high rates across the country, and Quebec significantly lower, but still we're talking more than 1 million people in Quebec who are living in food insecure situations. I've not shown you anything so far on the territories, and that's because at the point that we were doing the work on 2021, we didn't have access to data for the territories. Statistics Canada reported moderate and severe food insecurity only for 2020 based on data from the Canadian Income Survey, and here you see the results. Nunavut and the Northwest Territories have substantially higher rates than we see in the provinces. If we were to add marginal food insecurity onto these numbers, they would be much higher still. We are in the process of trying to access data for the territories from the Canadian Income Survey, and I hope that Proof will release a short report on the territories before this year is out. So it's on the radar, but we didn't have access to the data at the point that we were preparing this report. One other caveat before I start to tell you what we've learned about 2021 is this one. The information that we're working with was collected in the first 9 months of 2021. And even though that's only a year ago, this has been quite a year. When you look at changes in food prices in particular, but overall, the consumer price index shows unprecedented levels of inflation for basic commodities. I'm showing you this picture because I think probably what I'm about to say around 2021 and our learnings is a best case scenario, that everything we know about food insecurity would suggest that the absolutely stunning levels of price increase recently will have made the situation worse. And we look very forward to getting our hands on 2022 data soon so that we can report on it. Okay, back to 2021. The story of food insecurity as it relates to household composition is one that sadly we've seen for way too long in Canada. To be in a female-headed lone parent family, more than a third, 38%, are food insecure. Other groups that are notably high are the unattached individuals living alone or with others, and the male lone parents. That these are very, very high differences, right, compared to someone without children. There is a very strong relationship between food insecurity and income, whereby the lower the income, the higher the likelihood of someone being food insecure. That relationship is probably strongest for severe food insecurity, where it's almost imperceptible as we get to higher levels of income, but it rises sharply as income falls. But this picture is imperfect, right? There are people with higher income levels who are reporting food insecurity that you might think shouldn't be. And we can find people with low income levels who are reporting no food insecurity. Income's only part of the picture, and certainly income looking at it in this static way is only one part of the story. We also know that food insecurity is very, very tightly linked to issues of asset and debt and liability. One window into that is looking at housing tenure. Food insecurity is much, much more prevalent amongst people who rent their homes as opposed to those who own. And that's true even after we take into account income. And you can see in the middle, we've got people with mortgages who are less vulnerable than the renter, of course, because they had enough money to even get into the housing market, but more vulnerable, particularly through chaotic economic times, than those without mortgages. Food insecurity also varies dramatically by main source of income. At the top of this picture, you're seeing people on social assistance. And I should flag here that we're talking here about programs that are run at the level of the provinces or territories. We are incapable, with the data that we have access to, we're incapable of differentiating general welfare programs from disability support programs that are run by the provinces. So in Ontario, for example, this statistic is including both on the Ontario Disability Support Program and Ontario Works. But almost 2/3 of people on those programs overall, we're seeing are food insecure. I also want to flag this dark blue bar at the bottom, severe food insecurity. Almost half of people who report their main source of income as social assistance are severely food insecure. People who are relying on employment insurance and COVID benefits have been, in 2021 at least, better off than those on social assistance, but still the prevalence of food insecurity in these two groups is high. By COVID benefits, we're grouping a whole lot of special income supports that were introduced through the period of the pandemic and still in play in 2021. But the majority of the people in this bar are people receiving CERB or the Canada Recovery Benefit. And you can see that 41.6% of households whose main source of income was COVID benefits were food insecure. We move down the ladder and the rates drop, to the lowest being people on private pensions. Before I move on, though, I want to draw attention to this 13.7%. The majority of households in Canada are relying on employment incomes, and that's important because with 13.7% of them being food insecure, that means that roughly 1 in 7 households dependent on employment incomes in this country through this period are food insecure. And there are a lot of them. And so when we look at the total universe of households that are food insecure in the country and divide them up by main source of income, over half are in the workforce, relying on salaries and wages, but still unable to make ends meet. In addition, we've got the COVID benefits, the EI, a very, very small number here, right? Because through 2021, most people who would have been on EI ended up on CERB or CRB. So it's a small slice here. And then we've got the group on social assistance and then the pensioners and the others. One of the things that's new in our report for 2021 is that we've included some results of multivariable analyses. And I hope I don't drive you crazy with these, but we thought it was time to raise the bar in terms of what we were communicating about food insecurity, because I've just talked now about income and household composition and whether people rent or own their home and what their main source of income is. But we know for any one household, they've got all those characteristics and more. So here what I'm showing you is adjusted odds of food insecurity for main source of income, but taking into account a whole bunch of other characteristics of these households, where they live, what kind of a household it is, education levels, race or cultural identity, immigration, and home ownership and income. And so now what I'm showing you is the odds of being food insecurity if you're on social assistance, for example, independent of the fact that, you know, people on social assistance are more likely to be renters, they're more likely to have children, you know, all those things. Still, when we take those into account, compared to people who are in the workforce, those on whose main source of income is social assistance have 3.67 times the odds of being food insecure. So they are way more likely to be food insecure, even though there are characteristics about them that are probably on average different. The odds of food insecurity is somewhat lower for people on EI or COVID benefits, but still more than double the likelihood of food insecurity for people in the workforce. I think what we're learning from this is that there are things about these income sources and things about the reason somebody goes on them that tell us something else about risk that is above and beyond the income level or whether they're owning their own home. And I think we're learning about the effects of income instability and income shocks for these people on EI and COVID, and the grinding poverty that characterizes social assistance. Important to look at these guys at the bottom as well. After we take into account other household characteristics, people on public pensions have a significantly lower odds of food insecurity than people who are in the workforce, even though on the surface their prevalences look similar. And people on private pensions have a very low likelihood of being food insecure. This speaks, we think, to the stability and security of the incomes of people in these categories, but also the fact that pensioners have often other assets to draw upon. We've also taken a look at race, ethnicity, and Indigenous status. And here are just crude prevalence estimates for groups based on the, for individuals rather, based on their self-declared identity. And what you can see from this picture at a glance is that food insecurity in Canada is racialized. Those who are least likely to be food insecure are people who are white. And those who are most likely to be food insecure are people who identify as Indigenous. The multivariable analysis takes us a little further in understanding what that is about. The first adjustment I'm going to show you here is us adjusting for sociodemographic characteristics. So does somebody live in Quebec or Alberta? Is it a single parent home? Is it a household with high levels of education or not? Like, what's going on? And we can see that for all of these groups, even after taking into account differences like that, they have significantly higher odds of food insecurity compared to people who are white. When we layer on top of this adjustment economic characteristics, the story changes. Now, the racialized groups are not showing significant differences from the white. Yes, the midpoint of these bars is higher, but the error bar, the confidence intervals, all fall below 1, indicating that they're not statistically significantly different. So I think what that's telling us, for example, is that this substantial drop in the odds of being food insecure for people who are Black in Canada, the fact that it drops so much when we factor in economic circumstances, suggests that part of what we're picking up in the differences in prevalence here is the systemic racism that pervades our employment market, our housing market, the ways in which systemic racism in Canada controls who has access to wealth and who doesn't. Note that with the adjustments for economic circumstances, the odds of food insecurity for Indigenous people falls, but it still doesn't get anywhere near to the point of the odds of people who are white. I think that's to be expected. The variables that we're adjusting for here don't begin to pick up the extent of colonialism and the legacy of colonialism as it relates to problems like food insecurity. It matters that people are food insecure because food insecurity is a very sensitive indicator of pervasive deprivation. Yes, people who are food insecure have poorer diets than people who are food secure. Of course they do. They don't have enough money to buy the food they need. But when we scratch the surface, somebody who's struggling to put food on the table because of a lack of money is also very likely to be compromising their housing, to be behind in other bill payments. And if they have prescription medications, which most of them do, they are very likely not to be filling them or taking them as prescribed because of costs. Food insecurity in Canada is a potent social determinant of health. When we look at the health of people living in food insecure situations, whether we're considering physical health or mental health, chronic conditions or infectious diseases, it doesn't matter. Everything is worse for people living in food insecure situations. This conceptual framework tries to very crudely capture some of what's driving those extraordinary health disadvantages that correlate so tightly with food insecurity in Canada. Part of the story absolutely is the chronically compromised nutrition, but equally, if not more important, is the effects of food insecurity on mental health. The stress, the isolation that comes with the struggle to put food on the table, to not be able to afford what you need, it has a profound impact on people's mental health. Also, I've got this kind of broad category of health-related behaviors, sleep, physical activity, the ability to practice healthy lifestyles, the ability to take prescription medications as prescribed or travel to a support group. All of those things are compromised for people who are living in food insecure situations. So together they conspire to deteriorate health. There's a small but very powerful body of literature emerging, primarily through the United States, of the ways in which these elements of food insecurity impact immune function. And so we're at the edges, I think, of understanding and seeing a biological pathway through which food insecurity impacts people's ability to stay healthy and to resist infections and disease. There also is a vicious circle, though, and whereby people who are food insecure are more likely to have poor health, but people who have poor health are more likely to be food insecure, and they're less able to get out of food insecurity than people who are healthy. And this relates in part, I think, to the conversations that are going on now in some quarters about the association between food insecurity and disability, that people with chronic health issues are more likely to be food insecure, and it's harder for them to transition out. Because food insecurity is so tightly linked to health, it's also linked to healthcare utilization and to health expenditures. This rather complicated picture is an illustration of that. This is work that Feynman did looking at the likelihood of people being hospitalized in Canada based on their household food insecurity status. And what you're seeing on the left here is a whole range of diagnostic categories. The only category of disease that people in food insecure situations were not more likely to be hospitalized for than people who were food secure is cancer. That seems to be the one condition that doesn't track with this problem of material deprivation, but all the others do. And just to give you a sense of what we're describing here, adults in severely food insecure households in the course of a single year had more than double the likelihood of being hospitalized for respiratory conditions than people who were food secure. They have almost triple the likelihood of being hospitalized for mental health disorders when compared to people who are food secure. So the effects on health are real, they're tangible, we can pick them up through a variety of lenses, including our healthcare system. Another lens into the relationship between food insecurity and healthcare is this study that we did in Ontario now several years ago, looking at healthcare costs of adults in food insecure situations over a 12-month period, considering not just hospitalization, but the whole range of health services that people could access through our public payer system. And you can see that people in severely food insecure situations in this period were burning up more than double the healthcare dollars in the course of a year. I'm sorry this data is not more recent. Sadly, there has been a change in Statistics Canada's policies related to the sharing of data from national surveys, where we get this information about food insecurity, with health administrative data like provincial health care systems, where we would pick up the information about costs. So we're actually incapable of doing this study again now. And so I don't know how this relationship has changed since we published in 2015. What has happened in response to this problem? Well, what we've seen through the pandemic is unprecedented levels of funding allocated both from the federal and provincial levels to food charities and related organizations. This infographic is something that Proof prepared a couple of years ago to depict, it summarizes, I would say, my life of research on this topic. That one thing that I think we can say with certainty is that funding food charity does not change food insecurity. What does? Well, there's a growing body of research showing that where there have been public policy changes in Canada that have improved the financial circumstances of low-income people, they have reduced their likelihood of food insecurity. And that's true for both federal and provincial policies, and it's true across a broad spectrum of policies that have been studied now. Anytime anybody has been able to actually parameterize, to analyze a policy intervention that associates with an improvement to financial circumstances, we have seen an effect, a significant effect of reducing food insecurity. I'll talk briefly about a couple of those findings. First of all, the Canada Child Benefit. I'm picking out the Canada Child Benefit to focus on here because it is one of the Trudeau government's signature acts, right? And it is continually trotted out by government officials as this powerful intervention to reduce child poverty. It was introduced in 2016, and at that time, it wasn't all brand new. It kind of harmonized some previous child benefit programs of prior governments, renamed it, and added a bit more money to the table. We did a study when it was first introduced to try to understand what its effect was on food insecurity. So what you're seeing here are the prevalence of food insecurity, the distribution of food insecurity amongst families with children under the age of 18, which are the families who would be eligible for this benefit, both before the Canada Child Benefit was implemented and afterwards. And you can see that there is almost no change here. In fact, there was no change in food insecurity with the implementation of the Canada Child Benefit. The only thing we were able to identify is a small but significant and absolutely important change in the likelihood of severe food insecurity. It decreased a little bit with the implementation of the Canada Child Benefit, but that's it. Ratchet forward to 2021, we have 1 in 5 children under the age of 18 in Canada living in food insecure situations. So the Canada Child Benefit is not the success story that the government would have us believe, I think. Let's suppose they wanted to make the Canada Child Benefit more effective at protecting families from food insecurity. Well, I have 3 suggestions. The first is that they might want to factor in the cost of living. We know that there are areas in Canada that have very, very much higher living costs than others. And the notable one is Nunavut. Right now, people in Nunavut get the same amount of Canada Child Benefit as people in Medicine Hat or Corner Brook. They shouldn't. We've recently done a study, I say we, FAMEN has recently done a study looking at the effect of the differential in payments for children under the age of 6 and children 6 and over. And you may have noticed on the prior slide that if you have a child under the age of 6 and you qualify for the Canada Child Benefit, as most people in Canada do, you can receive up to as much as $1,000 more in a year, simply because that child is under 6. When the child has their 6th birthday, though, bye-bye $1,000. You're now dropped down to a lower level. What FAY's figured out is that that differential matters a lot, that the probability of food insecurity is lower for families that have children under the age of 6 than for families with children over the age of 6, because they're getting the extra money. I don't know what the Liberal government's idea was about making that differential, but our work would suggest that if you really wanted to tackle this 1 in 5, you would be extending that extra money to people who are 6 years of age and older. Lastly, there are thresholds, and the Canada Child Benefit is most generous to people with incomes below a threshold that is set right now at $32,797. But the rate of food insecurity amongst families with incomes that low in Canada is very, very high. And it would get lower if they would receive more benefit. But that's federal. Let's talk briefly about provincial policies. Here you see differentials in terms of food insecurity rates across the provinces, and they vary widely. More widely, I think, through the lens of these last few years than we have seen before in CCHS analyses. We did a multivariable analysis again, and I'll very quickly flag for you what we're seeing in this. We're taking into account now things like, how many of these households are working, how many are on pensions, immigration patterns, what have you. And still, when we factor those things in, we can see that to be in Quebec is to be substantially better off. Compared to Ontario, the odds of food insecurity for a household in Quebec is 0.71, so almost 30% lower. The odds of being food insecure for people in New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta are significantly higher. The fact that these differences persist, even after we take into account the characteristics of the households in these provinces, suggests that we are looking at differences in provincial policy and the importance of provincial policy decisions vis-a-vis this problem. We've done, or Faye has done, some work looking at provincial policies, and there are three that surfaced through that analysis: minimum wage, welfare, and the level of provincial income tax that is clawed back from the lowest income households. I don't think this list is exhaustive by a long shot. These are the things that we were able to look at in that particular study. But the fact that we have significant effects for those three policies, again, speaks to the fact that some, or probably much, of the difference in prevalence estimates across the provinces that we're charting in 2021 is a function of provincial policy decisions and how they play out in terms of the resources of the lowest income families. What about food programs? Well, there's been even more talk about food programs with the recent spike in food price inflation. We have a few that we can take a look at. Most importantly, we have a long-standing now federal food retail subsidy program in the form of Nutrition North, implemented in 2011. We did a study, or Andréane Fafara-Saint-Germain did a study looking at the effect of the implementation of Nutrition North Canada on food insecurity in 10 communities that were recipients of that program in Nunavut. And you can see the rates of food insecurity over the years that she looked at. Even after taking into account a whole lot of other differences in the sample over this period, Andréane established that there had been a significant and substantial rise in food insecurity in communities receiving Nutrition North. A rise, not even that it had remained static, but that food insecurity is getting worse in these communities. Last month, Tim came across a paper by a group in the Maritimes, led by a professor from the University of New Brunswick. This was another analysis of the effect of Nutrition North on food insecurity in the North, using a broader expanse of geography than Andréane did, and more years of CCHS, but coming to the same conclusion. So Nutrition North, even though over these last few years we've seen the federal government pour more money on it, there's no evidence that it's even able to maintain the status quo in terms of food insecurity in these communities. So it is a damning indictment on the idea of food subsidies. What about other programs? Well, we did have some modeling a few years ago. I say we, Craig Gunderson led this work, taking data from the United States and saying what would happen if we adopted some of their programs. And I just want to briefly flag our findings, because these are programs that are very much a topic of conversation right now in Canada. The United States has long had a national school feeding program. And when we looked at what it would look like if Canada were to adopt their national school lunch program, and this is us stacking the deck, looking at the effects on low-income families that would qualify for a free school lunch if they were living in the United States, and what was the effect on moderate or severe food insecurity. You can see a small decrease. We also looked at what is SNAP, what is formerly food stamps, so a much more generous cash transfer actually than the material benefits you'd realize from a school food program, but with a lower income threshold. And again, we saw a significant and not unsubstantial drop in the levels of food insecurity. But before anybody takes these findings as evidence that these programs would be effective in reducing food insecurity, look at how much of each of these groups remains food insecure. And then I would encourage you to take a look at some of our other policy analyses to see just how much we can achieve with the existing programs as opposed to new ones, because those rates are not particularly impressive when compared to something like an improvement to social assistance. Okay, so to conclude, our work would say that reducing food insecurity is a policy decision, and that to achieve it, we need to see income supports for particularly low-income working-aged adults that are adequate, secure, and responsive to changes in cost of living like we're experiencing now. There are two ways to think about that. One is to think about the potential, as I tried to outline very quickly this afternoon, the potential for improvements to things like child benefits, the Canada Child Benefit, or changes to provincial programs that impact incomes. The other conversation, though, that I think it's time for us to have is about wrapping this all into one conversation, which is the need for an income floor. I'll stop there, and I will look very forward to your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about our work, please take a look at our website. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my slides now. stop sharing.
Thank you, Valerie, for again making the dire call for our governments to take action regarding reducing food insecurity across Canada, especially with the profound statistic of 1 out of 5 children in Canada living in food insecure households. Before I pose questions from the audience, let me ask you one question. The report says that one promising approach would be to extend a guaranteed income to all Canadians through a basic income. But it looks like that will not be enough to achieve zero hunger in Canada. How else can the gap be filled? And can civil society informed initiatives fill that gap?
Oh, this is quite an opening question. I actually take issue with the assumption that zero hunger won't be achieved through a guaranteed annual income. I'm not convinced that's true. First of all, what's hunger? Where's hunger being picked up in this story? The closest measure of hunger we've got is severe food insecurity, because those are the people who are in households that have reported actually not eating because of a lack of money for food. We know from things like the study of the Canada Child Benefit that severe food insecurity is a condition that is supremely sensitive to increases in income. That to find a family or a household who is so stressed that they cannot literally cannot eat because of a lack of money. You give them more money, they will buy necessities. They will pay off their debts, they'll pay their rent, and they'll buy food for themselves and their children. And we see that with the very dramatic changes in severe food insecurity as soon as there's more income in the household. So I'm not convinced. I mean, I know that there is an argument that, oh, there are other things besides income going on. I don't think we even know what those other things are until we deal with the income problem. That to deal with, to take a household that's severely food insecure and give them a secure, adequate, guaranteed income month after month after month, I think we're going to see a whole lot of those other problems get dealt with too. So I'm not prepared to say, oh, income's only part of the story. We've got to do something else. No. We've got to deal with the income problem. And we're not even going to know what the rest of that story is until we do it, because the income is such an important driver here. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to questions from the audience. And we appreciate all questions, and we'll try our best to get to as many as we can within the short time we have left. But be reminded that after the webinar, we will share a recording and relevant links and a summary of key ideas to address unanswered questions. Okay, our first question from the audience to Valerie. Over the past few years, there have been many different surveys from public opinion polls, food banks, and Statistics Canada on the difficulties Canadians have faced with affording food. These surveys appear to say different things about trends in food insecurity. How should we reconcile these different surveys and their results with regards to the change in food insecurity through the pandemic and into this time of record inflation now?
Well, you're right. I mean, I'm happy for the question. There have been a ton of surveys. I mean, but I think that we need to trust surveys that are using standardized measures of food insecurity, which is what that 18-item module is, as opposed to a single question like, do you think you might have to use a food bank in the next 6 months? Mm-hmm. So it's questions that are measuring people's experience over a reasonably long period of time, and not hypothetical. Do you think this might happen to you? Are you worried about this? But like, have you had enough to eat? And if you haven't, like, how often have you not? I also think that sampling is very, very important. A lot of these web-based surveys are very rapid fire things. And I mean, they're coming from all over the place, pollsters, but also Statistics Canada has engaged in some of that work through the pandemic. I think it's important to work with things like the Canadian Income Survey, which is why Proof has put their money in that, in that we're seeing something that is standardized, that is reliable, that is population representative. So I mean, I think everybody with these small polls had expected to see dramatic fluctuations, but we're measuring on this survey, we're measuring an experience over 12 months. It's a more stable measure, but it's also probably a more realistic thing in terms of what matters for health and well-being, and also what matters in terms of public policy. So I would say that everybody needs to see these short pollster type surveys with, take them with a grain of salt.
Okay, thank you. Another question we have, and I think it will be our last question. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions after this one. Okay. What is your understanding of why food insecurity has remained relatively static over the last 5 years, while poverty levels, according to Statistics Canada, have reduced drastically?
Well, I think food insecurity rates have remained relatively static because we're not doing anything to address them. And, you know, this problem will not fix itself. We're seeing policy, you know, the same things happening year after year, probably the same people living in food insecure situations year after year, because nothing meaningful is being done to address that problem. Why is it that isn't represented by, you know, these poverty statistics? Well, certainly the poverty statistic on child poverty, there's a lot of debate about. And there are people who don't work in the area of food insecurity at all, but who have challenged the interpretation of the Canada Child Benefit dropping the child poverty numbers. So I would take those poverty statistics with a grain of salt. I feel like with food insecurity, we know what we're measuring. We're working with a standardized measure. It's tightly correlated with all these health outcomes, and it's not budging. And I think it's not budging because nobody's trying to budget.
Okay. Our second last question, thank you. Do we know why Quebec has a lower rate of food insecurity? And what is Quebec doing differently compared to other provinces?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think there needs to be way more work done to look at Quebec, but we've seen for years now signals that being a resident of Quebec is to be better off than to be in other parts of the country. Quebec has a whole fabric of social programs and policies that are different than other countries. I talked about the Canada Child Benefit, but most provinces in Canada have, and most territories, I believe too, have a child benefit program. Quebec's child benefit is higher than anybody else's. When we think about the recent spike in food prices and other costs, all of the transfers that happen in Quebec are indexed to inflation. Social assistance in most other places in Canada isn't even indexed to inflation. So, you know, there are some basic elements of social programs in Quebec that have been there for a long time and that I think are paying off now, because as we've hit more turbulent economic times, both through the pandemic and now with this inflation, people are being insulated by the provincial policies and programs in Quebec in a way that they're not elsewhere. So I don't think it's ever going to come down to one thing. There's a whole fabric of supports in place in Quebec that make sense and that are clearly more effective than what's going on, for example, in Alberta.
Okay, and then could you possibly explain why the very high rate in Alberta? Sorry.
No, I can't. I mean, Alberta, it does have a child benefit, and it, I believe, has made some improvements to this program called ISH, its disability support program. But no, I mean, you know, Alberta looks like it's a rather lean, mean place to live. I think that's what that 20% is telling us. And I think, I mean, I hope somebody in Alberta will pick up the torch now and do some more work to dig deeper into what Alberta isn't doing. I'm not sure that they've gotten a whole lot worse in recent years, but they certainly are sitting in a place where I think there's a need for them to, you know, review what they're doing in terms of things like social assistance, the indexation of it, other sorts of supports. Yeah, okay. I'm just seeing a note here that AISH is no longer indexed. Yeah, you see, measures like that make no sense, and they're you know, somebody is paying the price for those as the, you know, costs of commodities rise right now.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the audience. Doesn't the drop in CB once kids become 6 correspond to children transitioning from very expensive daycare to public, so-called free school? Are households incurring higher costs regardless of no longer paying for daycare?
I think that that's an idea that people have, that the, children that are not in school, are too young to go to school, those families would need more money to support childcare. What I can say in response to that is, when we look at food insecurity, if that was what it was about, that the additional $1,000 was being consumed by daycare, then those families should look the same as families with older children, or they might even look worse because the $1,000 isn't enough to pay for the expense of daycare. But that isn't what we see. We see the opposite. We see that they look better from a food insecurity perspective than households that don't have the luxury of someone under the age of 6 living in them. So it doesn't play out that way. So I think this daycare argument and this idea around childcare, I think, to be honest, I think it's a very middle class kind of thinking. I don't think a lot of people that are, vulnerable to food insecurity, I don't think they've even contemplated paying money for daycare, let alone, the $1,000 being enough or not. I don't buy it. I can believe that that's been part of the rationale for it, that preschool children needed this extra money. But the fact that we see them actually being less likely to be food insecure, and that we've got higher rates of food insecurity among somebody who's 7 as opposed to somebody who's 5, there's something wrong with this picture. And the daycare argument, I don't think washes.
Okay, thank you. And next question. 2022 is a lot different from 2021. As you've already said, you're waiting to see the data for 2022. But due to the presence of armed conflicts, increased cost of energy used in food systems, climate changes, and the impact of C-19, what, in your opinion, should be done in order to be proactive in regards to these issues?
I'll try to be provocative too.
Freudian slip.
I think we're seeing a little glimmer of this already with things like the bump up in the GST and the GST credit for, I think what needs to happen is we need to better insulate the lowest income people from the hardships that they are invariably facing right now with this spike in prices. It should be prompting governments across the country to review their policies and make sure they have nothing that goes to low-income people that isn't indexed. And as I said before, at this stage in the game, only Quebec, Yukon, and I believe it's Manitoba. No, New Brunswick, sorry. Quebec, Yukon, and New Brunswick are indexing social assistance rates to inflation. Nobody else is onto that yet. That needs to change, and it should have changed long ago, but this inflation, I think, screams that it needs to change now. So I think simple things like indexation need to be invoked, and this is the reason why they should have been all along. On top of that, we do need to go back and see what we can do to supplement the incomes, I think, of the lowest income people. Measures like the federal bump up of the doubling of the GST credit are good ones, but I mean, it's just such a small amount of money, it's not going to be enough. But I think it's targeted supports for the lowest income people. We do not need to see the kinds of stupid spending we had through the pandemic, where, at one point there was a one-time only bump up to the Canada Child Benefit of $300, but it was to all households. So, there were households with incomes over $300,000 that got checks for the Canada Child Benefit because of that bump up through the pandemic. We don't need that kind of stupidity right now, and we can't afford it. We need to see, long-term increases to the incomes, like the bottom end of that Canada Child Benefit.
Thank you, Valerie. I think I provoked you. Our last question from the audience. Oh, sorry, I'm being told. Our second last question from the audience.
Didn't we already have that one? It's okay. I'm happy that people are engaged in this material and they've got questions. I mean, I'm totally happy to stay on and answer questions. Yeah.
Okay. Any suggestions or examples of advocacy or other work food security community action groups or municipal organizations or government can take to address some of the root causes of food insecurity?
Okay. one thing that I think is really interesting to watch, last year, I believe it was, Prince Edward Island, it was an MLA from the Green Party who put forward a motion to get the government of Prince Edward Island to commit to ending food insecurity and poverty in their province. And so they actually, created a piece of legislation and they all signed on to it. And now, it's going to be fascinating to see if Prince Edward Island is able to do that. I don't know that they will be able to do it without federal help, that's for sure. But I think that bold moves like that one, it was from an MLA called Hannah Bell in Prince Edward Island. I think bold moves like that, even if they're, at one level purely symbolic, I think it's important to put this stuff on the table at both at the provincial level and at the federal level and say, this is intolerable. The idea that 1 in 5 children in this country live in a food insecure household, that's ridiculous. And so to put that on the table, in a public forum, like a legislature or a parliament, and say, let's all, join hands today and agree that that is unacceptable. And then what PEI has got from that legislation that got passed is actually, benchmarks. Now, by this year, we should have achieved this level of reduction. And, maybe they won't. I know we saw that with the child poverty commitments several years ago in Canada, but it names it as something that we all agree needs to be dealt with. It puts it in the place where it needs to be dealt, which is government, not community. And it gets us focused on, how are we doing? So I think that's a direction that I'd like to see more provinces go in, and I'd love to see that happen at the federal level. Targets that are measurable and that are committed to.
And as you say that, I recall seeing this summer for the first time a youth farmers market being held in Prince Edward Island, I believe. Yeah, Lennox Island. Our last question. Given the health implication of food insecurity, as you explained so well, it's not just about food, it's the health implications along with what it's doing to our healthcare. What do you think the role of public health and medical professionals is with regards to food insecurity?
Oh, this is a hard one. I feel terrible, really, because people who work in health are right now among kind of the frontline workers in terms of witnessing the consequences of our pervasive, persistent rates of food insecurity in Canada. I think in terms of a patient, clinician interaction, there's probably not a lot that can happen because, people who are in healthcare don't hold the purse strings for things like, decisions around minimum wage or the Canada Child Benefit. I think it's really, really important. 2 things: that at an individual level, people who are in the healthcare system as clinicians or practitioners of some sort, insofar as you hold the keys to accessing things like disability benefits or subsidized drugs or special diet allowances or what have you, insofar as healthcare providers are the gatekeepers to additional benefits, you need to open those gates as wide as you can and as often as you can. On top of that, what we badly need is healthcare professionals to speak publicly about the need to address this problem. Healthcare, I know there's been a lot of backlash and a lot of conversation about the place of healthcare providers through the pandemic, but these groups have a huge amount of social and political capital. We badly need things like the Canadian Medical Association to step up to the microphone and say, God damn it, we've got to put an end to the food insecurity in this country because it's driving up healthcare costs and it's a preventable risk and we've got to go for it. We badly need healthcare professionals to put their faces in front of this and say, make it change. We haven't seen that. We absolutely have not seen that yet. But I think given the amount of social and political capital that rests with our medical profession in particular, but also allied health professionals, I think we need to see these organizations step up and speak out about this problem because it is their problem too.
Thank you very much, Valerie. You've been making this dire call for over 12 years, I believe, and have consistently said the same thing regarding—
I was a brunette when it started.
You said the same thing regarding food insecurity. It is that food insecurity is directly related to low incomes, and it is racialized people who are most food insecure, and specifically, it is Indigenous peoples across Canada who are most food insecure.
Yeah.
Today, on the eve of National Truth of Reconciliation Month, I want you, the audience, and the rest of us to leave with a thought. A few weeks ago, I overheard a conversation among immigrant Caucasian gardeners on colonization and slavery. One of them, a Caucasian male who identifies himself as Canadian, in quotations, said, "I do not believe in taking on the guilt of the sins of my fathers." As you leave us today, I ask you, what are you doing with the privileges that the sins of fathers have provided you? What are you doing in the attempt to make amends through acknowledgements such as National Truth and Reconciliation Month? And specifically, what are you doing to ensure the government is doing more to address food insecurity in Indigenous communities? Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Byron. Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much for everyone joining us today. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good day, all.
Thank you. You're a rock star, Afua.